The hum of the servers filled the room like a relentless tide, vibrating through my bones as I stood there, alone in the dim glow of blinking lights. My hands pressed against the cold metal rack, knuckles white, while silent tears carved paths down my cheeks, tears I hadn't allowed in years. As CEO of Harlan Dynamics, I'd forged an empire from sheer will, rejecting every whisper of softness that threatened to crack my armor. Vulnerability was for the weak, and I was anything but. The weight of it all, the endless boardroom battles, the isolation of my ascent had finally pinned me here, in this mechanical sanctuary where no one could see. But then, the door clicked open behind me, a soft intrusion slicing through the noise. I froze, wiping my face too late as her footsteps halted. Riley Thorne, the new junior analyst, her pale silhouette framed in the doorway, eyes widening at the sight of me unmasked. In that instant, the fortress I'd built trembled. Everything shifted, an unwelcome spark igniting in the shadows between us. My world at Harlan Dynamics was a fortress of glass and steel, towering over the city skyline like the unyielding barrier I'd constructed around myself. As a Black woman who'd clawed her way to the top, past skeptical investors, biased mentors, and the constant undercurrent of doubt, I ruled with precision. My office a panoramic cage overlooking the sprawl below. Every morning began the same, the elevator's silent ascent, my reflection in the polished doors staring back with composed ferocity. Dark skin flawless under the tailored suits that signaled power without apology. I'd learned early that softness invited exploitation, so I dismissed it all. The lingering glances from colleagues, the tentative invitations to after-work drinks, with a curt nod or a redirected question. My voice steady as the quarterly reports I demanded flawless. Board meetings were my domain, where I'd pace the length of the mahogany table, dissecting projections with a gaze that silenced interruptions. Numbers don't lie, I'd say, my tone laced with the authority earned through sleepless nights and strategic sacrifices. The room would lean in, hanging on my words, while I ignored the ache that sometimes stirred beneath. A quiet longing for something beyond the metrics, a connection untainted by ambition's sharp edges. But I buried it deep, layering isolation over isolation, convincing myself that solitude was strength. The office pulsed around me, a hive of analysts and executives buzzing with calculated energy. Yet I moved through it like a shadow, untouchable. My presence a reminder of the empire's iron core. That isolation deepened with the arrival of Riley Thorne, the white junior analyst assigned to my analytics team 3 months prior. She slipped into the corporate storm quietly, her desk tucked in the corner of the open floor, surrounded by screens and stacks of data printouts. Pale-skinned, with hair the color of fresh linen pulled into a practical bun, she carried an unassuming air. Precise keystrokes, reports delivered early. Her voice soft during presentations, but edged with insight that caught even me off guard. I first noticed her during a routine review, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she outlined market trends, her blue eyes focused, oblivious to the subtle hierarchies at play. There was something disarming in her efficiency, a flicker of curiosity piercing my routine as I watched her from across the room. Not the overt ambition of her peers, but a steady competence that hummed like the servers themselves, reliable, yet understated. In those early days, our interactions were minimal. A brief, "good work," after her first solo report. My words clipped as I scanned the pages, noting the clean logic without praise. Yet her presence lingered in my periphery, a pale contrast against the diverse faces of my team, her outsider status mirroring the barriers I'd long navigated. I told myself it was nothing, just the novelty of fresh talent. But in quieter moments, waiting for the coffee machine's drip or staring out at the city lights from my office, I'd catch myself wondering about the life behind her composed facade. Did she feel the weight of this world too, or did it bend to her with ease? The thought unsettled me, stirring that buried ache, the one that whispered of connections I couldn't afford. As weeks blurred into routine, the corporate sanctuary held firm, its rhythms a balm against any internal unrest. But pressure mounted from an impending merger, deadlines stacking like storm clouds, and the isolation I'd cultivated began to press inward. Late one evening, after a grueling call with overseas partners that left my defenses frayed, I sought escape in the server room below, its constant hum a mechanical confessional, promising solitude amid the glowing racks. I descended the stairs, the cool air wrapping around me like an old ally, unaware that this retreat would soon shatter the careful boundaries I'd drawn. The server room's chill seeped into my skin as I leaned against a rack, the fluorescent hum amplifying the chaos in my mind. A system alert had pulled me down here earlier, red warnings flashing across the monitors like accusations, data streams faltering under the merger's strain, much like the fractures I'd hidden beneath my composed exterior. I'd come to reset the nodes myself, bypassing IT to reclaim some control. But the failure mocked me. Circuits overheated, backups corrupted, mirroring the isolation that had eroded me from within. My breath came shallow, the weight of decisions unshared pressing until tears welled unbidden, hot against the cold air. I swiped at them angrily, but they persisted, silent sobs racking my shoulders in the dim blue glow. A vulnerability I'd armored against for decades. Footsteps echoed from the corridor, faint at first, then halting abruptly as the door hissed open. I stiffened, heart slamming against my ribs, but it was too late to compose myself. The rack's shadow couldn't conceal the damp trails on my face or the tremor in my hands. Riley stood there, silhouetted against the hallway light, a tablet clutched to her chest like a shield. Her eyes, wide and unguarded, locked onto mine, the shock rippling across her features, pale skin flushing slightly, lips parting in a breath that carried no sound. For a suspended moment, the server's drone was the only rhythm between us, her gaze tracing the raw exposure I'd never meant for anyone to witness. The unbreakable CEO reduced to this fractured figure in the machine-lit gloom. "What are you doing here?" The words snapped from me, sharp as a command, my voice reclaiming its authority even as I straightened, wiping my cheeks with the back of my hand. I stepped forward, the heels of my shoes clicking against the grated floor, forcing distance into the space she'd invaded. "This area is restricted after hours. Leave. Now." But my tone faltered at the edges, the demand laced with a desperation I couldn't fully mask. Her presence amplified the humiliation, turning my private unraveling into a shared indictment of my solitude. She didn't move, her frame rooted as if the shock had anchored her. The tablet lowered slowly, her fingers tightening around it, knuckles paling further. I was checking the logs for the anomaly," she murmured, her voice soft, threaded with a hesitation that carried no judgment, only a quiet concern that unsettled me more than accusation would have. Her eyes held mine, not with pity, but with an empathy that pierced the armor I'd hastily reassembled, unspoken yet palpable, like the hum vibrating through the air between us. "Are you okay? You don't have to." She broke off, faltering, as if the words themselves breached some invisible protocol. The warmth in her gaze stirred something unfamiliar, a flicker deep in my chest that I quashed immediately, recoil as if burned. "I'm fine," I cut in, colder now, turning toward the console to feign focus on the flickering screens, my back a barrier against her scrutiny. "This stays between us, Thorne. One word of this, and your position here ends. Understood?" The threat hung heavy, a reflex to reassert the power imbalance. Yet even as I issued it, her lingering presence tugged at the edges of my resolve, that soft concern lingering like an echo in the confined space. She nodded, slowly, the movement deliberate, her expression shifting to one of quiet resolve rather than retreat. "Of course. but if you need anything, I'm here." The offer was tentative, stripped of presumption, yet it landed with a weight that stirred an unwelcome thaw, a sanctuary in her words I hadn't sought, hadn't known I craved. She backed toward the door then, her footsteps retreating with a reluctance that mirrored the pull I felt. The shared secret forging an invisible thread. I dismissed her with a curt wave, waiting until the door sealed shut before exhaling, the room's isolation reclaiming me but forever altered. That night, as I ascended to my office, the encounter replayed in fragments, her wide eyes, the unspoken empathy, binding us in the office shadows, where daily proximity would now carry the weight of what she'd seen, forcing encounters laced with the memory of my unmasked ache. The days following that server room intrusion unfolded like a taut wire stretched across the office floor, pulling us inexorably closer even as I willed distance. Harlan Dynamics thrummed with its usual cadence, keyboards clacking in rhythmic urgency, phones trilling like distant alarms. But now her desk exerted a gravitational force, drawing my gaze despite the spreadsheets demanding my focus. Riley handled the data with quiet efficiency, her fingers navigating complex models as if they were extensions of her thoughts, pale hands steady over the keyboard, while the merger's projections loomed like gathering storm fronts. I'd catch myself pausing mid-sentence during team briefings, my eyes tracing the line of her shoulder as she leaned into her screen, oblivious, or perhaps not, to the way the light from her monitor cast a soft halo around her form. It was a pull I resented, this subtle invasion of my routine, her presence a constant reminder of the fracture she'd witnessed, the tears that had betrayed my unyielding facade. Micro-interactions began to accumulate, fragile threads weaving through the corporate weave. In meetings, our eyes would meet across the conference table, brief electric contacts that lingered a fraction too long, her blue gaze holding mine with a steadiness that spoke of shared secrets, while I forced my attention back to the agenda, the charged silences between us heavy with the unsaid. She'd hand me reports in the hallway, our fingers brushing the paper's edge, and I'd nod curtly, murmuring, "Adequate," though the word tasted hollow against the warmth radiating from her proximity. Power dynamics simmered beneath it all. I'd issue commands from my glass-walled perch, revise the forecast, Thorne, by end of day, my voice laced with the authority that had carried me here, yet her compliance masked a growing mutual awareness, her "yes, ma'am," delivered with a subtle tilt of her head that suggested she saw through the veneer, glimpsing the woman who'd crumbled in the server room's glow. I overheard glimpses of her vulnerability one afternoon, lingering near the break room as she confided in a colleague over lukewarm coffee, her voice fraying at the edges. "The workload's relentless. I barely sleep. Juggling this with my loans feels like I'm drowning some days." The words echoed my own concealed pains, the nights I'd spent staring at ceilings cracked by isolation, the ambition that sustained me also eroding the softer parts I'd long suppressed. It mirrored too closely, that quiet struggle, her pale features drawn with fatigue as she stirred her cup, unaware of my shadowed listening post. In those moments, empathy stirred unbidden, a reluctant kinship that blurred the lines of hierarchy, making her not just an analyst, but a reflection of fractures I pretended absent. Internally, I ruminated endlessly, questioning the pull that softened the edges of my armor, her unassuming competence chipping at the walls I'd fortified with boardroom victories and solitary evenings. Why did her quiet persistence unsettle me so, turning routine oversight into something perilously personal? I'd retreat to my office, the city sprawl a blurred sanctuary beyond the windows, and find my thoughts drifting to the way her eyes had held no judgment that night, only a gentle anchor amid my storm. It was dangerous, this thawing. As a Black CEO navigating glass cliffs and veiled biases, vulnerability was a luxury I couldn't indulge. Yet her presence hummed like an undercurrent, awakening longings for connection that ambition had starved. The office, once a sterile domain of control, now pulsed with her subtle influence. Every interaction a test of my resolve. As the merger deadline loomed, a critical project strand us together after hours. The floor emptying into twilight while we pored over volatile data sets in the dim conference room. The unspoken electricity amplified, air thick with the scent of cooling coffee and flickering screens. Her insights cutting through the fog as we leaned close over charts, close enough to feel the warmth of her breath, the boundaries straining under the weight of what simmered beneath. The conference room's long table became our reluctant confessional that night, papers strewn like fallen leaves under the harsh overhead lights that cast elongated shadows across the walls. We worked in tandem, her voice a steady counterpoint to my directives, unraveling the merger's tangled forecasts line by line. The hours stretched, marked only by the occasional chime of the office clock and the deepening hush as the building settled into slumber. Coffee cups accumulated, their steam long dissipated, leaving a bitter tang in the air that mingled with the faint, clean scent of her, something like fresh linen and subtle citrus, invading the sterile space without effort. As we debated projections, her arm brushed mine inadvertently over a shared spreadsheet, the contact electric, yet fleeting, sending a jolt through me that I masked with a cleared throat and a pointed question about revenue streams. But the warmth lingered on my skin, a quiet invasion that mapped the contours of my restraint. Those overtime sessions multiplied over the following weeks, pulling us into a rhythm of dim-lit collaboration where professional boundaries blurred into something more intimate, though unspoken. We'd start with data dives, her insights sharp and unadorned, cutting through my skepticism with a logic that demanded respect. But inevitably, the conversations veered into personal territories, halting at first, then flowing like tributaries into a larger current. One evening, as rain pattered against the floor-to-ceiling windows, she mentioned her upbringing in a small Midwestern town, her voice softening with the weight of memory. Pale hands tracing the rim of her mug, she spoke of class divides that had shaped her, scholarships clawed from modest roots, the constant proving ground of being the first in her family to chase a degree in analytics, her outsider status amplified by the corporate world's polished veneer. It echoed our contrasts, her whiteness a subtle privilege navigating doors I had to shatter, yet her words carried no entitlement, only the raw edge of striving against invisible ceilings. I listened, the pathetic fallacy of the storm outside mirroring the internal one brewing, her vulnerability a bridge across the racial chasms we'd both traversed in silence. My own revelations emerged guarded, parceled out like fragile artifacts in the quiet interludes between equations. I'd admit to the isolation of my ascent, the boardrooms where my authority was tested not just by competence, but by the color of my skin. The mentors who offered guidance laced with condescension. The nights spent fortifying myself against the world's subtle erosions. "It's a sanctuary I built alone," I said once, my gaze fixed on the rain-smeared glass, voice low as if confessing to the city beyond. Her listening was a revelation in itself, her blue eyes steady, unblinking, offering a sanctuary I hadn't sought. Her nods punctuating the air with an empathy that eased the ache without demanding reciprocity. In those moments, the power imbalance hummed between us, tangible as the space separating our chairs. Yet her presence softened it, turning hierarchy into a shared human frailty rather than a divide. The longing escalated in the aftermath, nightly reflections haunting my penthouse solitude, where the city's lights twinkled like distant accusations. I'd lie awake, the silk sheets cool against my skin, mind replaying the curve of her wrist as she gestured over charts, the way her laughter, rare, soft, rippled during a late-night breakthrough, thawing the edges of my composure. It was an ache, profound and undeniable, the forbidden proximity intensifying with every brush of proximity, every exchanged glance that held too much. I questioned it relentlessly, this magnetism drawing me towards softness I'd rejected. Her pale form a contrast that both unsettled and captivated, stirring longings for touch unspoken, for a connection that transcended the office's cold metrics. The internal storm raged, vulnerability a cage I paced within, her image indelible, the space between us charged with needs that tested every boundary I'd sworn to uphold. But as our collaborations deepened, whispers began to stir in the halls, colleagues' sidelong glances sharpening with speculation. The rumors coiled like smoke, forcing me to confront the unraveling control, the peril of this emotional cartography we'd unwittingly charted together. The whispers in the hallways of Harlan Dynamics grew insidious, slithering through the open-plan floors like currents in still water. Colleagues sensing the subtle shift in my orbit around Riley, without ever witnessing the server room's fracture. Envy laced their judgments, murmured over vending machines or in clustered desks. Speculation about favoritism, laced with the biases that shadowed my every promotion. The unspoken implication that my attention to her stemmed not from merit, but from some racial or gendered favoritism they couldn't quite articulate. I'd overhear fragments during my circuits through the office, a vice president's sidelong glance as I paused near her desk, his voice dropping to confide to an aide about the CEO's new pet project, the words dripping with the resentment born of their own stalled ascents. It stung, not for the inaccuracy, but for how it amplified the perils of my position. A Black woman whose authority was forever scrutinized through lenses of suspicion. Riley bore it too, her pale cheeks flushing under the weight of sidelong stares during team huddles. Yet she carried on with quiet dignity, her reports impeccable, refusing to let the undercurrent erode her focus. Ethical boundaries tested me relentlessly in those weeks, as I found myself mentoring her with a subtlety that blurred the lines between boss and confidant, my office door ajar more often for her post-meeting debriefs. I'd summon her under the guise of merger strategy, the glass walls reflecting our figures as she stood across my desk, outlining risks in her measured tone. But the discussions veered, my questions probing not just data, but her instincts, offering guidance on navigating corporate politics, the veiled negotiations, the alliances forged in shadowed corners, that I'd learned through trial and isolation. Trust your read on the numbers, but watch the room, I'd say, my voice low, leaning forward as if sharing classified intel, her nods absorbing it with a gratitude that warmed the space between us. It was mentorship, yes, but laced with the intimacy of shared vulnerabilities, her presence turning my sanctuary into a confessional where power yielded to something perilously personal, the HR protocols looming like distant thunder, reminding me of the chasm ethics demanded we maintain. Moments of charged intimacy punctuated the days, isolated elevator rides trapping us in the confined descent between floors, the mirrored walls multiplying our reflections until the air hummed with subtextual desire unspoken. One afternoon, as the doors sealed us in after a floor 3 pickup, her shoulder brushed mine in the press, the contact sending a shiver through the fabric of my blouse. Our eyes met in the reflection, hers wide with that same unguarded empathy from the server room, mine holding longer than protocol allowed, words faltering into silence heavy with the weight of what we circled but never named. The merger's tightrope, she murmured once, her voice a thread in the hum of the rising car, laced with a double meaning that spoke of our own precarious balance. I nodded, throat tight, the pathetic fallacy of the building's sway mirroring the internal tilt. Desire, a current pulling against the barriers of rank and restraint. Her quiet resistance emerged in gentle pushes against my authority, revealing an inner strength that both challenged and captivated me. Her pale features set with resolve during a heated strategy session, where I overrode her projection with a sharper cut. With respect, she interjected softly, her blue eyes steady. The data suggests a softer pivot. Rushing it risks the base. The room stilled, my team glancing between us, but her words carried no defiance, only a reasoned push that echoed her outsider's clarity. I paused, the authority I'd wielded like a shield momentarily suspended, conceding with a nod that acknowledged her insight. The exchange forging a mutual respect that deepened the pull. Her strength a mirror to the resilience I'd forged in biased boardrooms. My deepening vulnerability haunted the nights, dreams invaded by the ghost of her touch, fleeting brushes in waking hours replayed in sleep, her hand steadying a falling file, the warmth seeping through layers to unsettle the fortress I'd claimed unbreakable. I'd wake in my penthouse, sheets tangled, the fear of softness consuming me like a slow tide, the ache of forbidden longing eroding the edges of my control. As a Black CEO, I'd rejected vulnerability to survive. Yet Riley's presence unraveled it, her empathy a siren call threatening the empire I'd built on unyielding ground. The internal storm raged, powers imbalance now a cage of my own making, her image indelible, stirring terrors of exposure amid the longing that refused to fade. Then the corporate crisis struck, a data breach rippling through our systems, demanding her insight to trace the fault lines, drawing us into uncharted emotional depths as the office mobilized under midnight lights. The data breach hit like a fracture in the foundation, alerts blaring through the night as firewalls crumbled under invisible assaults, pulling the entire team into a frenzy of diagnostics and damage control. Riley's insight proved vital, her pale fingers tracing code anomalies with a precision that cut through the panic, while I orchestrated from the war room, my commands sharp to mask the tremor in my core. But as the crisis peaked, servers groaning under the strain, much like the tension coiling between us, I resolved to reassert the cold professionalism that had always been my shield. The next morning, with the immediate threat contained but fallout lingering, I summoned her to my office under the pretense of a debrief, the glass walls reflecting my composed stance as I leaned against the desk. "Thorne, your work was adequate," I said, my voice edged with frost, deliberately shortening our exchanges to bare necessities, avoiding the personal drifts that had eroded my boundaries. I assigned her to a peripheral task, routing her reports through intermediaries, convinced that distance would quench the unwelcome spark. Yet her persistence chipped at it relentlessly, her emails arriving with subtle clarifications that demanded response, her presence in briefings, a quiet anchor pulling me back despite my efforts to orbit elsewhere. Those attempts faltered into failed suppressions, stolen glances across crowded rooms evolving into lingering stares that synced our hearts in silent, rhythmic discord. During a strategy pivot meeting, as projections flickered on the screen, my eyes sought hers amid the sea of faces, holding until the air thickened with unspoken currents. She'd meet them, steadily, a faint curve at her lips betraying the mutual awareness, her blue gaze a mirror to the vulnerability I'd exposed that night in the server room. I'd look away first, heat rising beneath my skin, but the pull returned in waves. The way she'd linger after sessions to clarify a point, her voice soft against the office hum, drawing me into conversations I cut short with clipped nods. It was a cycle of denial, each evasion heightening the ache. I'd retreat to my desk, fingers drumming against polished wood, willing the longing to subside. But her image persisted, pale and precise, unraveling the threads of my resolve with every unintended proximity. External pressures mounted like gathering shadows, HR protocols looming as stark reminders of the impossibility threading our connection. Whispers evolved into formal inquiries, a compliance officer's email citing perceived favoritism in her assignments, The words a veiled accusation that highlighted the chasm of power, race, and rank separating us. As a Black CEO, I'd navigated such scrutiny my entire career, the biases amplifying every decision into potential scandal. Yet this felt personal. The protocol's a cage, underscoring how our shared secret could topple empires built on fragile trust. I reviewed the policies in solitude, the fine print blurring under my gaze, the fear of exposure twisting like a knot. One misstep, and her career, our fragile orbit, would shatter. The corporate sanctuary turning predator. It forced stricter boundaries. My interactions reduced to emails and proxies. But the denial only amplified the hum, the space between us charged with needs that policy couldn't silence. In a rare, unguarded moment during another late audit, she shared a fracture of her own, her voice faltering over cooling laptops as we isolated a residual glitch. "Sometimes I wonder if I belong here," she confessed, her pale hands stilling on the keys, eyes distant with the weight of imposter echoes that mirrored my own buried doubts, the outsider's perpetual proof, her class-rooted hesitations intertwining painfully with my racial isolations. Her admission hung heavy, an emotional mirror reflecting the vulnerabilities we'd both armored against, her quiet strength cracking just enough to reveal the shared ache of striving in worlds not designed for us. I nodded, throat tight, offering a murmured, "You do," the words escaping before denial could reclaim them, our pains weaving into a tapestry that deepened the forbidden pull, making separation feel like self-inflicted wounds. The internal storm brewed fiercer in the aftermath, the space between us humming with unspoken need, testing every boundary I'd sworn to uphold. Nights blurred into ruminations, her empathy a persistent echo eroding my fortress. I'd pace my penthouse, the city lights a cold constellation, questioning the magnetism that softened my edges, the fear of vulnerability clashing with the longing for her steady gaze. It was a denial unraveling at the seams, each try-fail cycle tightening the coil until tension snapped. Then, in the dim hush of an empty floor after a grueling review, a private confrontation erupted. Words spilled unbidden, the truth forcing its way into the open air between us. The conference room door sealed us in with a soft click, the empty floor beyond it swallowed by the hush of after-hours Harlan dynamics, where only the distant hum of ventilation marked time's passage. We'd lingered after the review, ostensibly to tie off loose ends on the breach report, but the air between us crackled with the unresolved, her chair pulled close to mine under the pretext of poring over final notes. Riley's fingers traced a line on the page, her voice trailing off mid-sentence, the words dissolving into the charged silence that had shadowed us for weeks. I felt it then, the breaking point arriving like a fault line giving way. My chest tightened, the weight of denials too heavy to carry further. "Riley," I said, my voice low, breaking the quiet as I set the pen down, my gaze locking onto hers, those blue eyes widening slightly, reflecting the sterile glow of the overhead lights. "I can't do this anymore. The pretending. That night in the server room, you saw me. The real me, not the CEO, not the unbreakable one. And since then, you've been unraveling everything." The admission spilled out, raw and unfiltered, the ache she'd awakened pulsing like an open wound. I'd spent my life rejecting softness, fortifying against the world's biases that demanded I be ironclad. Yet her quiet empathy had pried open the fissures, stirring a longing that now demanded voice. She stilled, the paper crinkling under her hand, her pale features paling further in the fluorescent wash, a flicker of surprise yielding to something deeper. Recognition, perhaps, of the mirror she'd held up to my isolation. Tears welled in her eyes, glistening like fractured light, and she leaned forward, her voice a whisper threaded with truths she'd guarded as fiercely as I had. "I've felt it too," she confessed, the words halting at first, then gaining momentum, her breath uneven. From that moment, seeing you there, not weak, but human, it changed how I saw you, how I saw myself. I'm just the junior analyst, white girl from nowhere, scraping by in a world that doesn't always notice me unless I prove it 10 times over. But with you, it's different. You listen. You push me to be better. And it terrifies me because I know the lines we can't cross. Power. Everything between us. But I can't stop caring. I can't stop wanting to be the one who sees you. All of you. Her tears spilled then, tracing silent paths down her cheeks. The sterility of the conference room amplifying the vulnerability. Her truths laid bare in the glow that cast long shadows across the table. Echoing the racial and class divides we'd navigated in subtext, now surfacing in this raw exchange. The peak tension crested in that suspended breath. The forbidden line crossed, not in grand gesture, but in whispers that bridged the chasm. My hand moved of its own accord, reaching across the divide to cover hers, where it rested on the table. Pale skin warm against my darker tones. The contact a jolt that sent ripples through the air, our breaths mingling in the narrowing space as we leaned closer. No words now, just the press of fingers intertwining. Tentative yet deliberate. The touch a release of the storm we'd bottled. Her thumb brushed my knuckle, soft and anchoring, while I traced the curve of her wrist, the intimacy profound in its restraint, mending something fractured without demanding more. It was electric, that connection, the power imbalance dissolving into shared fragility, her presence a balm against the biases I'd internalized, the ache easing into a fleeting peace where hierarchy faded, leaving only us, two women glimpsed in the half-light, hearts sinking in unspoken rhythm. Joy flickered in the aftermath, a brief illumination shadowed immediately by reality's weight, the consequences pressing in like the closing walls of the room. Her hand squeezed mine, a smile trembling on her lips, but her eyes held the awareness of what this meant. HR shadows lengthening, rumors coiling tighter. The empire I'd built teetering on the edge of scandal. My position as a Black CEO amplifying every risk into potential ruin. "What now?" she murmured, voice laced with the bittersweet edge of our truths, the merger's deadlines a stark reminder that this sanctuary couldn't last. Yet in that moment we lingered, her head tilting to rest lightly against my shoulder, the contact pure and unadorned, her breath steadying against my neck as the fractures I'd ignored began to knit. Her empathy a quiet force, reshaping the isolation I'd claimed as strength. Dawn filtered through the blinds hours later, casting pale stripes across the table strewn with forgotten papers, bringing clarity with its inexorable light. We parted hands reluctantly, the necessity of separation dawning like a cold truth. This connection, profound as it was, carried perils too vast to ignore. The bittersweet pull of what we'd awakened now demanding restraint, pulling us toward the unraveling that awaited. The dawn's clarity sharpened into resolve over the following days. The conference room's confessions echoing in the hollow spaces between our stolen glances across the office floor. We acknowledged the chasm, then, in hushed exchanges during empty elevators or shadowed corridors, the gravity of it pressing like an unyielding weight. Power's imbalance, a yawning divide. My position as CEO, a beacon for scrutiny that her junior status could never escape. Privileges, subtle currents amplifying the racial and class perils that bound us in forbidden tension. "This can't sustain," I murmured one afternoon, her hand brushing mine fleetingly as we passed in the archive stacks. The contact a spark, quickly quenched by the reality of boardroom eyes and HR's invisible nets. She nodded, her blue gaze shadowed with the same understanding. The ache of what we'd awakened, now a shared burden too vast to bridge without collapse. It was a decision forged in necessity, not desire. The empire I'd built demanding sacrifices that isolation had once made bearable, but her presence had rendered intolerable. Those final shared intimacies unfolded in the quiet fringes of Harlan dynamics. Empty offices becoming transient sanctuaries where we'd linger under guises of final reviews, hearts heavy with promises whispered against the hum of dormant screens. One evening, as twilight bled through the blinds, we sat side by side on the leather couch in my auxiliary suite, her shoulder warm against mine, the air thick with the scent of cooling paper and unspoken farewells. "I'll carry this," she said softly, her fingers tracing idle patterns on the armrest near my hand, the gesture laden with the tenderness we'd restrained, evoking the longing for mornings unmarred by hierarchy, evenings free from peril's shadow. I leaned into her briefly, my voice a low rumble of vows. "Find your space. Grow beyond this cage." The words heavy with the love we'd skirted. Her nod, a silent echo of commitments we couldn't fully claim. The pathos of rain-streaked windows mirroring the internal deluge. Our vulnerabilities intertwining one last time in the dim light that softened the edges of our contrasts. To free her from the entanglement, I orchestrated her promotion with calculated precision, framing it as opportunity masked in corporate benevolence. A lateral move to a partner firm's analytics division across the city, her talents too sharp to confine within our strained orbit. I pulled strings through neutral channels, endorsements laced with praise for her breach insights, ensuring the offer arrived as merit's reward rather than escape's necessity. She accepted with a quiet grace during our final private meeting, her pale features composed, yet etched with the sorrow of severance. "This is right, for both of us," she affirmed, though her eyes betrayed the wound. The promotion a bittersweet liberation that severed the daily pull while preserving her assent. It was my gift and my severance. The power I'd wielded now bent toward her flourishing, even as it hollowed the space she'd occupied in my routines. The ethical tightrope navigated at the cost of proximity's warmth. Solitude reclaimed me in the server room's mechanical embrace weeks later, the racks humming their indifferent symphony as I traced the grated floor where she'd first seen my fractures, echoes of her gaze a lingering wound that pulsed with every breath. The blue glow cast familiar shadows, but the air felt thinner now, stripped of the secret we'd shared. I pressed a hand to the cold metal, the chill seeping into my palm like the isolation I'd once embraced, now amplified by her absence. The ache a profound reminder of softness reclaimed, yet forever altered, her empathy having etched indelible maps across my guarded heart. The biases I'd armored against seemed sharper in reflection. The corporate sanctuary, a cage once fortified by rejection, now resonant with the vulnerability she'd awakened. A ruminative peace settling amid the unresolved longing. Parting words exchanged in the lobby's sterile hush carried silent understanding. Her suitcase at her side, as the elevator doors yawned open, our eyes meeting in a final weighted communion. Love's echo without resolution's comfort. Her soft, "Take care of yourself." A murmur that bridged the chasm one last time. My nod heavy with the truths we'd voiced and the perils unspoken. She stepped away, the doors sealing her silhouette into the descent, the office hollowing in her wake. My softness, once rejected, now a quiet undercurrent, reshaping the fortress from within as I turned back to the empire, forever marked by the connection that had dared to breach it. I stood at the window, the city lights blurring through unshed tears as her silhouette faded into the night, the ache a persistent echo of the bridge we'd built and burned. If this slow burn stirred your hidden longings, subscribe for more tales of forbidden hearts that linger long after the end.